Today's time, today's world, it can be difficult to find hope.
Out of tragedy came messages of hope.
But men like Caleb that lived each and every day to the fullest, that was a light that should give us all hope.
In a crowded Scott County High School gym, hundreds came to honor Deputy Caleb Conley. Family, friends, classmates, colleagues, and even those who never knew him, but all shared in the grief of an officer's life being cut short 10 days ago.
Not that every day after hasn't been bad, but May 22nd was awful.
Those who worked with Deputy Conley day in and day out knew they worked with someone who loved his job, serving the public and loving his family.
It was one of the honors of my career to supervise Caleb Conley for his first 3 years in law enforcement.
As an incredibly proud father and an attentive husband, he cherished his family deeply.
And two of the most important women in his life, his wife and mother, spoke of their grief and memories of simply Caleb.
Caleb was an exceptional father. He loved his children so much. He would do anything just to see them smile.
Since the age of 3, he would desire to become a police officer like his father and his uncle. He wanted to be just like them.